Well, welcome to this week's episode of the Cancer Cured Me podcast. This is Russell Pete, your host, and today I've got another fantastic interview for you this afternoon. I want to introduce you to a new friend of mine, someone who I've gotten to know in the last couple of months particularly well because, believe it or not, he and I had the same exact type of cancer. But I want you to hear his amazing story and how cancer, she's not just cured of cancer like me and many others are, but how cancer also cured him. He's got such a fantastic story. So let me introduce to you my new friend, Bruce Clark. Hey, Bruce, welcome to the Cancer Cure Me podcast.
Hey, Russell, thank you. I appreciate the invite and looking forward to a great recording here.
Fantastic. Well, Bruce, let's just get right into it, man. Again, I've already mentioned that you and I, we met through a mutual friend, to put it that way. We were trying to connect the dots and see whose friend it was. I think it was our friend Steve Orduno. God rest his soul. He ended up passing away recently, a couple of years ago. But man, as always, just do me a favor and share with our listeners your cancer journey. Then we'll get into later how cancer cured you and all that stuff. But tell me your story. If someone says, tell me your cancer story, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be glad to. Yeah, it was 2020, so of course that year was when all the nonsense with the COVID started,
right?
And the beginning of 2020. And as a small business owner, I was really affected by that. We a contracting business. So, we were facing a lot of trials and challenges and unknowns. And the thing was, how do we survive that, right? And as a business person, but there was nobody to ask because nobody ever been through anything like that.
Right.
And the fear factor and all the things that went along with the COVID thing and everything was pretty significant. But in June of 2020, Father's Day, actually, I was having a bout of diverticulitis, if you know what that is. But that's basically an inflammation or infection in the colon. And most people have what they call little polyps, like a little pouch on the colon, and sometimes they get infected. And so I was like on my back, with pain in my abdominal area from this. And so at the time I didn't have medical insurance, unfortunately, so I just had to tough it out. And it's kind of debilitating. So when I did finally get insurance in August of 2020, the doctor said, okay, well, I'll prescribe antibiotics. And I said, okay, great. So a 10-day run of antibiotics. That pretty much cleared up the diverticulitis. But by that time, I had already lost a bunch of weight and, I couldn't eat still very well and those kind of things. So I got the antibiotics and then that seemed to help. But after about 2 weeks, I still had pain in my upper right torso, just below my rib cage. And then, I thought it was part of the diverticulitis because it was all the abdominal area where I was having pain. But so I told my wife, look, there's something wrong. I got to go to the ER. So I went there thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to the ER and COVID is going to be packed. Right. And, but the thing was, they would not let my wife in. So she had to drop me off because they would only let people in. I went in there and there was hardly anybody in the place, so I was going, okay. So I got in there and I described what I was happening and the physicians there said, okay, we're going to do a CT scan and an ultrasound.
Right.
So after a couple hours, they did that. They did the ultrasound and I told the technician doing the ultrasound, man, because she had me on my side and this and that. And I told her right where the pain was. I told her, you're right on it with your probe, so. And then the CT, when I came back, one of the nurses says, man, you were gone a long time. Okay. So waiting for the results, I was sitting there and then the physician assistant came in and he says, well, because they did blood test as well, blood work. And he said, your white blood count is kind of high, but you could get that roll in your ankle. And then he points to the other page and it said lymphoma. And I was like, and just like this, I told him, well, that was unexpected, which it was. I mean, that was the last thing I ever expected to hear at that point. And so, I was pretty well shocked. It was just at that moment rocking my world. Here I am by myself in the emergency room. And, I had to call my wife to come pick me up. And so I'm thinking like, man, the word cancer, it's pretty heavy, I mean, I didn't know.
Tell her, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about cancer. I mean, I was really in kind of shock, and I'm thinking, well, is this a death sentence? What am I going to do? But one thing, and I don't know if I thought of it right off as a believer, as a follower of Jesus, it came to mind, by his stripes, I am healed, in the past tense, and that became significant as time went on. My faith is part of this whole journey.
Right.
And so I called the wife and said, hey, I'm done. Come pick me up. And the whole time I'm waiting, I'm thinking, well, how am I going to tell my wife, that I have cancer, Yeah. And so she got there, and I told her, look, why don't you park for a minute, so, because we had to drive home. But so we did. And I told her, well, because she's asking, well, what'd they say? What did they say? And so I told her, that they said I had lymphoma. And that I would have to see an oncologist, for treatment and so on.
Right.
And then at the same time, we're just talking about it's like, I need to call my kids. I have an adult son who's married with his own kids, and an adult daughter who lives near me, here in California. And then my daughter with her family is in Georgia. So, I have 5 grandkids. And it's, so I called we're talking, well, how do we tell my kids? I mean, again, not knowing anything about cancer, not knowing if this was a death sentence or how we're going to respond to it, how we're going to deal with it. None of those things. So I called my son and told him, and my daughter too. And that was a really emotional experience, to not only to tell my wife, but to tell my kids, that I had cancer, and it was scary, not knowing all these things. So, at that point, I started after that was to start scheduling oncology appointments and those kind of things. And here in California, I was with a facility called Kaiser Permanente.
Familiar with them? Yeah.
So I went in, and they're telling me, look, we got to do some more tests and this and that. They did more blood tests and said, oh, your calcium is too high. We need to lower it before we can even start any kind of treatment. And so they gave me an infusion, via intravenous infusion with I don't remember the medication, but within 24 hours, I was throwing up, man. I had headaches. I was like, and it was Labor Day weekend, long weekend. And, I had a bunch of side effects from this stuff. So, following Tuesday when they opened up, I called them and, tell them, okay, well, that's enough of that. I'm not doing that again.
Right.
But so talking to the oncologist, a young lady, and she said, well, I had 2 choices for chemo. That was their first line of treatment, a less invasive or a more invasive. And I said, well, let's do the less invasive.
Of course.
So, because, I started doing some research after that between, and just like, hey, what is lymphoma?
Yeah.
What are the treatments? And one of the treatments is what they call R-CHOP. It's chemotherapy that involves 5 different drugs.
Yeah.
And pretty invasive from what my research was telling me.
That's what I had. It's really bad stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I chose the less invasive. So I went 2 days a month for 6 months. And then at the end of that treatment, we did a PET scan, and they determined that the chemo had not been 100% effective. I still had the lymphoma.
Wow.
And their next suggestion. How long
was that again? I'm sorry.
That was I was diagnosed in August of 2020.
How long on the chemo before they said
6 months? So I started the chemo in September of 2020. Right. And so that lasted for 6 months. And actually, I went through it really well. I didn't have side effects to speak of. I, went in there and, just being in that infusion room was quite an experience, as you know, and because, there's all types of people there, all walks of life, all different age groups. And one thing I noticed is that there are people who come in that seem to be sick. They are depressed sometimes, or they're just quiet, or all this. So that was a whole new experience, being in an infusion room for several hours with a needle in my arm, right. Getting infusion of the chemo.
Yeah.
But I still tried to be as upbeat as I could and interact with the staff there and so on. And so it wasn't a bad experience as far as side effects and those kind of things.
Right.
But so after the initial round, they said, yeah, you still have some lymphoma left. And Kaiser suggested I do a bone marrow transplant. Yep. But first, I would have to take the R-CHOP, then go into the hospital where they give you more chemo and that kills everything, including your bone marrow.
It kills your whole immune system. Yeah, that before they could do that, because they have to take your bone marrow out before, then they wipe out your immune system, and then it's almost like planting a new yard. That's what the guy told me. He said then they kind of rebuild your immune system from the beginning all over again, and this is all part of the protocol. But I mean, I don't know how I just thought I don't want to do that. But anyway, right. I'll let you go ahead and finish your story.
Yeah, and I thought the same thing. So I mean, we checked it out, right, and we went to L.A. because that's where would have to take place. I mean, that's an hour and a half drive from us. And they said, oh, no, you got to stay up there in like a hotel or whatever, get treatment every day. You need a driver. And stay once they get through the initial process. So you're in the hospital for 4 to 6 weeks. I mean, isolated because, as you said,
you have no immune system. You can die from a cold. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have no immune system. So after listening to him, I'm going, no, I'm not doing it. I'm going, hell no, I'm not doing that. This does not sound like something I'm interested in.
Right.
And I even talked to several other doctors, second opinions. And in the meantime, I'm checking this stuff out, man. I'm checking out treatments, holistic treatments, because we kind of like that, the holistic, integrative, more natural stuff. What can we do? And so I'm already thinking, no, there's got to be alternatives to something so severe, something so debilitating as a bone marrow transplant.
Right.
And there are cases where your own bone marrow can be rejected, And so it wasn't going to be a fun trip. So eventually, and talking to, and I would like to encourage people, man, if they're with their doctor and they don't particularly care for that person, or ask for a second opinion. Don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion.
Absolutely.
And my first oncologist, and one of the appointments we had, I had developed a thing on my face, and I thought it was like a whitehead, like a zit or something, or a pimple. And it was fairly small at the time. And I'm sitting 3 or 4 feet from her, and I asked her, would you take a look at this, because it's not going away. And she said, oh, well, she wouldn't even get out of her chair to come and look. And she said, oh, I'll give you antibiotics. And by this time, my wife and both at the same time are going, no, you won't, because this is not part of the cancer protocol, to be doing this kind of thing. And so we got a different oncologist, which was a good move.
Good for you. Yeah.
But also, I remember talking to one of the supposed lymphoma specialists there, and Chris Wark, you mentioned him, and I had some information from him, and I was asking him, like, okay, well, do you think sugar has anything to do, diet or sugar has anything to do with the prevalence of cancer? And he's saying, no, I don't. And I'm thinking, well, this guy's kind of an idiot. He doesn't know, right? So eventually, when I completed all the chemo there at Kaiser, I decided to get away from Kaiser. I was not happy with the people, the doctors there, the treatment that they were suggesting, and so on. So I had a very nice lady help me get into a different health care program, insurance, and so on. And I went to an independent doctor for an oncologist called C Care, the letter C Care. Mm-hmm. And he was a great guy. You know, he was an older gentleman, but oncologist, very much a people person, but they're limited on what they could do. And so in June, May, I believe it was, of 22, he, after being here he said, well, I did some research. I'm going to give you this pill because we were doing PET scans and C scans along the way, and it's showing the lymphoma. Right. And are you familiar with the PET scans and how they work?
Yeah, the CT, they call them eye to thigh. They scan you from your eye down to your thigh to check your whole body out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they give you a radioactive glucose, you know, a shot. So they let that circulate for a while. And what happens is that lights up in the PET scan because the cancer cells in particular take up glucose, and it makes it glow in the PET scan. The very first one I did, man, I looked like a Christmas tree. You know, I was so lit up all over my body, and that's how they determine the activity. And I had lymphoma, so the activity of how much glucose is taken up indicates, you know, the activity of the lymph nodes and where they're at in the body.
Right.
So went back to the C Care oncologist in May of 22. He gave me a pill that he said he did some research on that they had used successfully with lymphoma. Well, 6 days later, I was throwing up blood, and my blood pressure dropped so low, I was passing out. And so, you know, I had to go to ER for that and get straightened out and so on. So that was a fail, you know. I mean, realistically, this drug was $20,000 a month. But yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The manufacturer had a program, so they covered the cost of the medication. But yeah, $20,000 a month. I mean, ridiculously
expensive. Yeah.
Ridiculously expensive. So we knew that was a fail. And so, well, I didn't do anything after that, except in the meantime, we're still doing holistic and so on. But, and I will back up a minute. And this is how we met. After I was diagnosed in early 21, we started researching alternative treatment centers. Several of them in Mexico, Rubio being one.
Right.
And there were a couple others we looked at in Mexico, and the different protocols that they had in mind.
Right.
So, but like it wasn't going to work out. Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So, you know, but this wasn't going to work out, you know, financially and so on, because none of it's covered by insurance.
Right.
And as a small business, I had 2 small businesses at the time, and, you know, being away 6 weeks or whatever the time period was, it just wasn't going to fly, not financially and for other reasons. So through a referral my wife got, I went to the Cancer Treatment Center in Irvine, run by Dr. Leah Keneally, which was one of the interviewers that on the summit we watched recently.
Right.
And so it was an integrative alternative treatment center. And I took intravenous IV mistletoe. I eventually did, you know, like ozone therapy and some of the other things. And they, through their testing, said their protocol eventually, when they figured out, was insulin potentiated low dose chemo. And basically, their protocol was to inject you with insulin, which opens the door for the lymphoma, the cancer cells, and then they use a low dose chemo, the R-CHOP, but a lower dose. So,
Right.
but it was coming out to about $4,000 a month out of pocket.
Wow.
So that was, I just had to stop. I couldn't do it anymore, and but still pursuing, trying to eat better and cleaner and doing this period of time. And with the faith, became really important. And I'll mention this too. One thing is about, we know is, and you had mentioned earlier, cancer affects the entire family. Yep. It's just not the loved ones, friends, and so on. It's not just the person with cancer.
Right.
It's all the people who are around and associate with, and our loved ones, and so on. Yeah. And my wife was my caregiver, during all. It's running me back and forth to hospitals and doctor's appointment and so on. And I think caregivers are so underappreciated, and especially as family members. But you're absolutely right. It's as if the whole family gets that disease.
Right.
And so, everybody's affected in this journey.
Now, if I don't mean to interrupt you there, Bruce, but I know the very first time we talked, we were out of shock. We thought it was not funny, but it was interesting that we both had basically the same exact cancer. I had a large B-cell lymphoma.
Mm-hmm.
You had non-Hodgkin's. You had non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Right.
And we both basically had the same story. I went to meet with my oncologist, but I had decided, unlike you, we're the same, but a little bit different. We had decided, because my father-in-law had, as my listeners know, I told my story on a previous episode, my father-in-law had already had lymphoma, and we watched him die, in our opinion, from the treatment, not from the cancer. And so we had decided, way before I even had cancer, because he died in 2010, I was diagnosed in 2013. We decided that if we ever got cancer, we were not going to go the conventional route. We're going to go the alternative route, because we had done research, like and there's other ways and other treatments and protocols out there that could help us with our cancer. So when I got cancer in 2013, I decided we're not doing this. But I didn't want to meet with the oncologist to find out what kind of cancer I had, what stage it was. But I wasn't planning on doing the chemo, because I knew that was going to be the treatment that they recommended. Sure enough, when we met with her, it was on Monday. I'll never forget it. She told me that I was stage 2, large B-cell lymphoma, very aggressive, very fast growing. Mm-hmm. She says, but here's the protocol. It's 18 months of this chemo, and we can start you on Friday. No time to think about, no time to research. Just, here's the plan, and we can get you started. It's like they want to throw you on a conveyor belt right away, But I didn't care, because I wasn't going to do it anyway. And that we just didn't go back. And most of my listeners know the rest of the story. I ended up having to go back 10 months later because the cancer had gotten so bad. And that's when I ended up having to have the R-CHOP, which is so strong. And as listeners know, for me at least, it had to be administered in the hospital over a course of 4 days, because that R-CHOP stuff is so toxic that, in fact, I had to be hooked up 24 hours a day to all these machines. One was monitoring my breathing, all these diodes over my body. I had a camera on me 24 hours a day for the 4 days I was there, because one of those R-CHOP drugs, one of the 5 drugs, can stop your heart, the other can stop your breathing. And it's tough. And, and being that, as you said, kind of that treatment environment is not the best, because everyone around you is looking bad and, and feeling bad. And I didn't go to an infusion center because I was in the cancer ICU ward of my local hospital, but there are other patients there, and I watched them roll patients in and roll patients out, if you know what I mean. But luckily I had my wife. My wife was my caregiver as well. But I didn't want to get into all that, because my story's been told already. But I remember on our initial conversation, you ended up having to go in for surgery or something. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, as time progressed, so in October, after my bout, what I was telling you with the pill the doctor gave me, didn't do nothing for a while as far as treatment. So he said, okay, let's take another CAT scan. And that was in October of 22.
Right.
And so I did that. And
just a year ago.
Yeah, a year ago.
Wow.
My wife and I went to the place where they did this CAT scan was near a local restaurant. So we went in and we're having dinner, And it was like 5:30, and I get a call on my phone from my oncologist's office. I'm going, well, that's weird, man. These people don't call me at 5:30 in the evening. And so he said, well, I mean, I hadn't been out of the CAT scan for maybe 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And he says, well, sorry, I have bad news. You have an abscess in your abdomen and it needs to be drained. And he said, well, if you feel bad, you can go into the ER or you can wait till Monday and I'll give you a referral to a surgeon, for this. Well, I thought, okay, Friday night, this doesn't sound great. An abscess in my, so I checked myself into the local ER, and 12 hours later, I was finally in a room, and they wouldn't do anything with it because they said, we don't do this kind of surgery here unless it's an emergency. And since I didn't have a raging infection or nothing like that, but they did at least get me on antibiotics, and that helped. So when I got released on Monday, I called my oncologist. He gave me a referral to a surgeon at UCSD. And so we called and scheduled an appointment for the following week. But while I was in the ER, I talked to one of their doctors there, and he says, yeah, you have an abscess. You got something going on in your abdomen. Your tumor is the size of a rugby ball. And I'm going like, what? I don't even know what a rugby ball is. It's like a football.
Right.
Yeah. So he goes, yeah, you're going to have something. And that was, talk about another shock. I mean, I had no idea that how could a tumor get so big? Right. And I'm still walking around, not feeling too bad. Right. But yeah, so that was a shock. And so we, like I said, we got out and made the appointment. The following week, we went to see a surgeon at UCSD, and he says, yeah, looking at your CT scan, yeah, you have a large tumor in your abdomen that has infiltrated your spleen, part of your stomach, and the tip of the pancreas. Wow. And he says, well, I can't tell if there is any bowel involvement or not, which could mean a colostomy or whatever. So we scheduled it. He goes, I'll be traveling in November. I would like to do the surgery myself, but I don't even know when I can get you in the emergency or into the operating room. So we're talking to his assistant. He left, and we're talking to the assistant. He come back about 30 minutes later, says, hey, it's a miracle. I like that word, miracle. He says, I got you in on November 2nd. That was 2 weeks for the surgery. And because he had explained, you're kind of in a rock and a hard place. If you don't do the surgery, you could have such a raging infection, we wouldn't be able to do anything. Wow. Or let's schedule the surgery.
Right.
And he said, I'm going to have to remove your spleen, part of your stomach, and the tip of the pancreas, and not knowing what else until I get in there.
Right.
So again, shock, it was like, and there was no time to go home and think about it. Right. We had to decide right there. And especially when he says, I got you available in 2 weeks. So, okay, let's do it. We scheduled the surgery, and 2 weeks later, so now I'm trying to prepare as a business owner to be, I was going to be out,
right.
With the surgery recovery and so on. And that was pretty emotional as well. Like, people, and like and maybe you've heard this, people when they go into surgery, they always tell you, well, there's always a chance you ain't coming out of the surgery,
Yeah.
And it happens. And so that was part of the whole shock or fear factor we had that day. But we really liked the surgeon. He answered all our questions. He took the time with us to explain what was going to be done. And so we felt very confident. If anybody's going to do it, we want this guy to do it.
Right.
So I did. I went into the surgery, and they removed my spleen. They removed a portion of my stomach and the tip of the pancreas. He also sewed up some holes in my diaphragm. And fortunately, praise God, there were no bowel involvement.
Yeah.
So pretty major hit, for that. So I spent about 7 to 10 days in the hospital, and then it was recovery afterwards. So the whole time, though, you got to go back to the faith, right? Just thinking about all that. And I was out, I saw my oncologist, was my new oncologist. So I transferred all my healthcare to UCSD. So I saw my new oncologist in December, a month later, a month after the surgery. And he said, well, what we got to do is start you on chemo, R-CHOP.
Oh my gosh.
and said, he's suggesting like we need to start you right away because they had reclassified. Prior to that, it was small B cell lymphoma, called a follicular, meaning slow growing. Right. But when they did the biopsy on what they removed, they had reclassified it as very aggressive.
Yeah, large B cell.
So he said, now we need to get you in chemo. And again, it was one of those things, R-CHOP, I'd already done my research. I knew it could be bad. And so, okay, let's do it. At this point, there's no more, delaying or anything like that. So about a week and a half later, I started the R-CHOP in an infusion center here in Encinitas. And at first they scheduled me for 7 hours in the infusion room. And because they start pushing it real slow to see your reaction. Are you going to throw up? Are you going to, have other adverse reactions, have a heart attack, whatever? Right. So after initial 2 hours, they said, man, you're doing fine. So
let's crank it up.
Yeah, they pushed it, they increased it. And so I was out of there in like 4 hours.
Right.
And I didn't, other than the first treatment. So I had 6 rounds, 18 weeks, 6 rounds of chemo. And other than the first one, which caused me to have a bowel impaction and stuff like that. And I went back to the doctor and said, look, man, you got to put me in a hospital. I don't care what you do, but we got to get this figured out because it's severe pain in the abdominal area,
right,
especially after the surgery. So finally, we figured out, and I would suggest anybody with that, man, keep your bowels moving, because that was part of the problem.
Yeah.
Once I figured that out, I praise the God, I didn't have any other side effects, man. I was in and out of there with all the other infusions in 2 hours.
Wow.
And so I didn't have, other than the first round, any side effects, not what I expected, not what I researched or anything.
So and now, you fast forward now, February of this year, 2023, you're doing great. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm doing good, even from the surgery and all of that. So in March of this year, I completed the chemotherapy. A month later, we did a PET scan. And they said, well, yay, you're in remission. Praise the Lord, right? Yeah, exactly. That you're in remission, except for one small lymph node, which is in what they call the retroperitoneal area. It's toward the back where your arteries and veins go near the kidneys and so on. And they said, it's still taking up some of the glucose. It still seems to be active. It's small. But we want to get a biopsy. So they did a needle biopsy and they said, yeah, it does have the lymphoma in there, but it's the slow growing type. Yeah. And the oncologist said, well, we should probably surgically remove it so we can biopsy the whole thing. Well, ultimately I saw my surgeon. He's going, no, I'm not doing that. It's way in the back. I'd have to open you up. And so, no. So the decision was made. We're just going to wait and see. Right. After PET scans and ceased until January and do another PET scan. But yeah, I'm in remission. Praise God. They call it remission in the medical field. We call it healed.
That's right.
And so, but the emotional, physical, mental toll through the journey has been significant. That's for sure.
Well, man, I keep saying this. We have so much in common when it comes to our cancer. We have more in common when it comes to what got us through our cancer, is our faith in God, our belief that Jesus died for our sins, and he suffered so that we didn't have to suffer, you and I. And but speaking of that, because that ties right into what I know you're going to say about not what got you through it, but you came through this thing. You've been cancer free, as I want to say. I'm just going to go ahead and claim it for you, brother.
Yes.
You've been cancer free since March of this year. I've been cancer for 8 years. So tell the listeners, again, the whole idea of the Cancer Cure Me podcast is not just to interview people like yourself and myself who have become cured or healed, as we like to say, but how cancer actually going through it made us better on the other side. So just could you mind briefly, if you had to sum it up, how would you say this whole cancer journey has changed Bruce Clark for the better?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, faith has been a big part of it. Trusting the Lord, and through this, and trusting in what His Word says, and getting the encouragement from other believers, the people I go to church with, and the things like this, and trying to be an encouragement to other people.
Right.
And because in the infusion center, I would see all types of people there that are up and down and so on. I even asked the nurses, look, do you see a difference in people coming in here that are depressed and down and out versus people who are upbeat in their healing and in their treatment? They said, absolutely. So mindset is a huge thing. And I think part of it, at least, is the faith. And coming from the initial shock of the diagnosis, being scared and upset, but at the same time trying to have a calmness and a peace with this. And it does give me a better understanding of how many people have cancer. They talk about pandemics. Cancer is a pandemic.
Absolutely.
And so
1 in 3 people today, 1 in 3 Americans have it.
Yeah.
But like when you and I are coming up as kids, I don't think we're the same. I think you might be a little bit older than I, but I remember coming up when we were growing up, you heard about someone who had cancer, right? Now,
right.
Everyone personally knows someone. And
right.
That's how bad it's gotten. Everyone in this country personally knows someone who has cancer. To me, that is an epidemic, a pandemic. For lack of better, that's an epidemic for sure. But yeah, man, I got to say, brother, we do have so much in common: our cancer, our faith, and what got me through is my friend Brooks, who referred me to the Rubio Cancer Center, gave me a little book called God's Creative Healing, and it just had all these prayers in there that I would pray every day, just literally commanding my body to heal itself using the faith and the belief. I believe that God gave us everything we need to heal ourselves, and then we'll just have faith. He said, and we could look at that mountain and tell that mountain to move, and it would get up and move itself to the sea if we just had the faith of a mustard seed. So I just believe, and I know I noticed as you told your story, it seems that as you relied more and more on your faith, it made those decisions that you and your wife had to make, even though they were last minute and not much time to think about it. It gave you the confidence to know, let's go ahead and do it, because not just because we have no other option, but because we're going to get through this. And if this is what God says we have to do, we're going to do it. We're going to trust that this option is an option that God is telling us that we have to do. And that's just so much peace, as you said, in knowing that God's got this. I don't have to worry about it. I can't have faith and fear at the same time. And that's what got me through it. That sounds like what's gotten you through it, man. And I appreciate you sharing that. What an amazing story. I was telling my wife earlier before, I said, I've got an interview today for the podcast. She said, with who? I said, with Bruce Clark. She says, that the guy you said he had the same thing you had? I said, yeah, but his was much worse. He had all kind of surgery. I didn't have to. And she says, yeah. And I said the same thing you just said. He's the one that told me this story, that he asked the nurse if the people who are going through treatment, who have a better attitude, come out better. And I remember saying that weeks ago when we talked, and that's so true. I believe that your mindset has everything to do with it. And if you believe you'll be healed, you will. Now, ultimately, God's in control. So not unfortunately, Bruce, as bad of a pandemic or epidemic as it is, not everyone's story is up like yours and mine. Some people actually die. But you and I both believe that going through it doesn't have to be a death sentence. We don't know if we're going to live or die. Only God knows that. But going through your cancer journey doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be a death sentence. You don't have to become your cancer. You don't have to be, if you believe it's a death sentence, then you will have a horrible experience going through it. If you have faith that God's happy going through this for a reason, then even if you don't make it through it successfully, you can go through it with a better perspective and maybe even a better quality of life as a result. So, brother, I appreciate your time. Thanks for being on and sharing your amazing story. I know people are going to benefit this. I can't wait to see the comments from the folks who listen to this episode and share it. And guys, once again, speaking of sharing the podcast, if you enjoyed Bruce's story or any other stories that you've heard in our podcast, be sure to share them with someone that you know who you think will benefit from it, whether they've got cancer, if someone in their family's got cancer. That's our whole goal here at the Cancer Cure Me podcast, is to impact others' lives by sharing our stories and the stories of others that we know and come in contact with, whether it's cancer or some other life-threatening disease that they may be facing, or their family members as well, because we know our families go through it with us. They may not have the cancer, but they go on the journey with us, and it affects them in ways that we don't even understand sometimes. So again, if you enjoy this episode, please share it, like and subscribe, they always say, and share it with someone else. And we look forward to talking to you on the next episode of the Cancer Cure Me podcast. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.